You ever been to Heritage Park or Capitol Lake? I haven't, but I don't live in Olympia. Maybe you've gone there, but either way, you probably didn't know the piece of history they're covering up. To go back to the beginnings, in the 1920s, Olympic Lake didn't exist. It's man-made and wouldn't come about until 1951. Instead, the land was home to the Deschutes Estuary, which in the 1920s would start to see an incursion of float houses on it. What is a float house, if you didn't know? I mean, you can probably guess. It's like a houseboat, just without the boat part, and it's just a house. And the houseboats chilling here were all good and dandy. But then 1929 hit, and then the Great Depression happened. The stock market crashed, which meant that companies started losing money, which meant they started firing people, which meant now you have a huge unemployed workforce, and everyone's poor and sad, and it just kind of sucked. And things were made even worse in the US due to the political situation, as Herbert Hoover would be sworn in as president, and there's a reason people don't like him very much, because he decided to take an hands-off approach to the whole Great Depression. Because of this, people tended to blame Herbert for a lot of the US's problems, and they weren't really wrong in doing so. Entertainingly to us now, though, they named a lot of not-so-good things after him. For instance, if you were sleeping under a blanket of newspapers during the time, which a lot of people had to do, you were sleeping under a Hoover blanket. And similarly, if you were living in a shanty town, you would have been living in a Hooverville, which brings us to what we're talking about today. Because where better to have your shanty town than on the water? At least, that's what Olympia's residents thought. Welcome to Little Hollywood. And as you might have guessed, the amount of float houses went up dramatically. In the 1920s, there was around 40. But pretty quickly by the 1930s, there was over 100. And it wasn't the greatest houses either, as you might have guessed. Many of them were cobbled together from scavenged wood or even cardboard, which is where the name Little Hollywood actually comes from. People wanted to contrast the fancy schmancy houses in Hollywood with the less schmancy fancy houses that were here now in Little Hollywood. There's also some talk because the shanty town that was in nearby Tacoma was called Hollywood on the Flats, which, I don't know, they might have been a name in cahoots. And now you may be asking, who lived in Little Hollywood? Well, actually, you're probably not, because I think you can pretty easily guess it was people affected by the Great Depression mostly. But who in specific were those people? I also can't really tell you that. I don't have any specific names. I really need to start scripting these videos. But I can tell you that much of Little Hollywood was populated by single men as well as families. There were also some single women, but they were far outnumbered. Additionally, there were a lot of immigrants proportionally to the rest of Olympia. The police captain would refer to the people of Little Hollywood at the time as good old bums. There were also some bad old bums, though. And while they were far outnumbered by the good old people living in Little Hollywood, unfortunately, they certainly damaged the reputation of the residents with the rest of Olympia. Coinciding with the Great Depression, Prohibition wouldn't actually end until 1933. And so while it was active, the Little Hollywood area would be a center for alcohol consumption and production. I think you can kind of get the idea. If you wanted to do crimes, Little Hollywood wasn't the worst place to do them. And because of that, a bad picture would pretty quickly be painted with stories of rapes and knife fights. Additionally, in 1933, though, hunger marches would sweep through Olympia. People were trying to get some relief from their depression conditions, and they would succeed a little bit. But it wouldn't be enough to hold off the depression, which would not end until the late 1930s. And around that same time, there was a plan underway. See, in 1937, Olympia decided that they wanted a lake, and they weren't about to let a shanty town stop them. And so they decided to evict every single person who lived in Little Hollywood so that they could build a lake where their houses were. Now, as you might have guessed, that wasn't too popular of an idea among the residents of Little Hollywood, but there wasn't much they can do. And so by the 1940s, the burning of Little Hollywood had begun and then been completed. All that was left of it was rubble. And by 1951, even that would be gone, as the Capitol Lake project would be completed. And that's kind of the story of Little Hollywood. It's not especially a happy one, but I think it is one that's important to be remembered. But if there's any conclusion to this story, it is the tale of Occupy Olympia. Little Hollywood may be gone, but the story of Wall Street messing around and screwing over people is one that has repeated itself many a time. And that was the goal of the Occupy Wall Street movement, a branch of which would become the Occupy Olympia movement, to stop Wall Street from messing around and screwing over people. There's a nice little bit of irony to know that decades later, people set up a tent city where Little Hollywood was and lived there to try and fight the same things that caused it to be created in the first place. Did Occupy Olympia succeed? No. But at least they tried. And I like to believe that somebody during these last couple months walked out onto the Capitol Lake shores and bought some GameStop stock. So that's the story of Little Hollywood. From a shantytown caused by economic collapse to nothing because they got burned. Did I miss something important? Put it in the comments. Or maybe you just want to tell me what I should talk about next. Also, put that in the comments. And if you've stuck around this long already, it'd be pretty cool if you considered subscribing.